Hello everyone, my name is Khyam Allami and I'm here to talk to you about Apotome, the project that I'm launching in collaboration with Counterpoint at CTM Festival in January 2021. Apotome is a generative musical environment that runs in a web browser and is based on using microtonal tuning systems and their subsets. It's designed to be used with its sister application Leimma, which is another web browser-based tool for exploring tuning systems and creating new ones. Although both the applications can make sound, their purpose is not sound design per se. There's plenty of other softwares around that can do that much better, but they serve a purpose to try and facilitate the exploration of these underexplored microtonal tunings, specifically from non-Western cultures, and to try and highlight what I like to call the repressed possibilities that we face today as a result of the way that modern digital tools that we use for music making have sidelined or almost exclusively ignored this subject for over 30 years now. This isn't a tutorial. There will be other videos published that go into more details of how these applications can be used. But in this video, I wanted to try and talk about the extra musical ideas behind Apotome and why I decided to try and create something like this and why I think it's important. I'm an oud player, an oudist. I'm also a drummer, and I also use electronic instruments and programming, recording. For many years, I've felt very sidelined and frustrated by the modern tools that we are all so reliant on today because of my interest and engagement in Middle Eastern music and specifically the Middle Eastern maqam system and its microtonal tunings. I know there are many other musicians across cultures who feel the same way. Today, whether we're composing by improvising using our instruments or using notation software or recording and manipulating audio, we're consistently reliant on the playback capabilities of these softwares so that we can hear what we're doing and navigate the creative process. Now, anything that helps us make music is a tool, whether it be a pen and the shape of the nib, or an acoustic instrument, or a sample library, or a digital software, or a hardware synthesizer. All of these instruments are tools, and they all affect the way that we engage with the creative process, and they also directly affect the results. Today, more than ever, we're reliant on these digital tools to help us get our ideas across, or even to find ideas in the first place. The issue is that these tools are almost exclusively reliant on the Western tuning system of 12-tone equal temperament, which has been around since the 18th century. But due to the hegemony of 12-tone equal temperament, the possibilities to explore and discover new things about musical systems from all other cultures, including tuning systems created by 20th century European and American composers, have all been repressed. Now, whether this is by ignorance or innocence, I feel that it reflects what researcher Philip Ewell recently called the white racial frame around music theory. But before we go there, let's look at what tuning is. Tuning is one of the most fundamental elements of music making, but it's also the least taught, the least understood, and the most veiled. Do we as musicians know what notes we're playing and why they sound that way? One of the major cultural and individual identifiers of music is tuning and intonation. And even though it's more relevant to non-Western musical cultures, it applies to all music. So what is equal temperament and what is microtonality? In music, there's a concept of the octave. And the octave is basically the doubling of a certain frequency. Throughout the ages, this octave has been divided in different ways in order to generate different musical systems. Equal temperament divides the octave into 12 equal steps. You can think of it a little bit like a drum machine that has a fixed grid for all the individual beats. Everything is equally divided. It was developed as a system around the time when keyboard instruments were starting to take a stronger, more prominent role in performance of European music and specifically in the composition. And at the time, the instruments would have to be tuned depending on the key signature that a particular composition was in. And there were limitations on the kind of modulations that could be made within that composition. So equal temperament was devised as a system that allowed for modulating from any key signature to any other key signature without having to retune the instrument. Before equal temperament in Europe, musicians and composers used all different kinds of tuning systems, also sometimes referred to as temperaments. These systems all used ratios, the idea of relativity, to create all the different divisions of the octave. Today, music that uses anything that's not equal temperament is generally referred to as microtonal. And microtonality is a fascinating subject. It has really captured the imagination and taken up countless hours of some of history's greatest minds. But it's also, unfortunately, a subject that is today filled with all kinds of inherent bias. When we research and try to understand tuning and microtonality, immediately we come across the figure of Pythagoras. Pythagoras, a Greek mathematician from around 500 BC, is credited with discovering the mathematical relationships in music. It's often said that he made this discovery by dividing a string. But when we look at history, we find out that the Pythagoreans were actually making their measurements based on string lengths using harps or lyres. And it wasn't until Euclid in around 300 BC that we get actual definitions of the division of a string and the ratios that that division uses. When we dig deeper, we find that Chinese theorists from around 1500 BC were creating similar musical systems but using bamboo pipes. They even went on to create a system that was so incredibly close to equal temperament but never took on in China. They also went on to create bronze bells that were based on the same principles of the tunings of the bamboo pipes, the same ones that are accredited to Pythagoras. And before them, Mesopotamians had developed a tuning system and a modal system that was systematized and codified in clay tablets from around the Old Babylonian period, roughly between 2000 and 2500 BC. Sadly, the literature and writings around tuning and microtonality tend to sideline these cultures and focus more on the Pythagoreans and the Greek developments, specifically because Greece is considered the cradle of Western civilization. These same tuning systems and ratios and mathematical ideas were being used thousands of years before Pythagoras, but until today they're still referred to as Pythagorean. Over the last 2 years, the amazing Philip Ewell has been doing a lot of work expressing what he refers to as the white racial frame of music theory. In his work, he shows how 18th century European music theory for a very specific kind of music made by quite a specific class is today in modern music education considered the sole representative of music. He also goes on to add how this comes from a racist and supremacist ideology that looks at the great composers of the European canon as being the highlighted geniuses that everybody should aspire to become. I would add that 12-tone equal temperament is an inherited remnant of that very same idea imposed on music makers across cultures and across all different kinds of platforms. It's the equivalent of forcing the whole world to speak the same language, 12 tones, with the same accent, equal temperament, but with different dialects, or different melodies. So how is this all relevant today? In reality, equal temperament was always a bit of a hyped up theory. It's really difficult to get instruments in tune perfectly in accordance to its rules. And we can hear that on old recordings. They'll have a different feeling, even though they're supposedly using this system. And that all changed once we started to see more and more electronic instruments. Electronic instruments are based on the idea of using electricity to make music. And because of that, they were always going out of tune and weren't able to communicate with each other. In the late 80s, musical instrument digital interface, MIDI, was developed by Dave Smith from Sequential Instruments and Ikutaro Kakehashi from Roland to keep the electricity in check and help the instruments be able to communicate with each other. But it was predominantly an economic concern. They were worried that the lack of compatibility between manufacturers would restrict people's use of synthesizers, which would ultimately inhibit sales. 10 years later, MTS, MIDI tuning standard, was developed as an ultra-high resolution specification that was integrated into the MIDI spec itself. And it allowed for all kinds of tuning systems and all kinds of changes between tuning systems without affecting whatever was being played at the time. Around that time in 1987, Wendy Carlos, who was developing a lot of software to be able to deal with all these microtonal tunings, wrote an article for Computer Music magazine called At the Crossroads. In it, she said, "This is the first time instrumentation exists that is both powerful enough and convenient enough to make practical the notion, any possible timbre, in any possible tuning, with any possible timing. Sort of a 3 T's of music. We've been treading water much too long, and I'm delighted that the real work can now begin." Unfortunately, exactly around that time, when music could have opened up to all these different possibilities, effectively the door was shut. It's worth pointing out that the problem here isn't to do with MIDI or with the 12-tone piano keyboard that we're also used to seeing. The problem is to do with implementation. MTS, MIDI tuning standard, has existed in MIDI since 1991. But the problem is, it's either rarely implemented, or implemented tokenistically, or implemented with an Anglo-European perspective on what music is, or implemented in very convoluted and complex ways with lots of menu diving, or with very limited sonic possibilities. Most importantly, these different implementations, or lack of, have done nothing but impede music makers' capabilities to truly have the freedom of a blank slate, where they could just explore a hunch or an idea without having an end goal in mind. This is what I refer to as the repressed possibilities. Musicians like myself who are interested in music of other cultures or are interested in these non-Western tuning systems effectively don't have the same freedom as everybody else who is happy to go along with it. But all music is suffering from it. Jazz bands that used to use acoustic instruments had a different kind of feeling. When you hear modern jazz bands today using digital pianos that are tuned to perfect equal temperament, the sound and the feeling is completely different. This is a direct result of the digital instrumentation being able to render equal temperament absolutely precisely. And that's something that we weren't experiencing before. And the same with electronic music that uses all kinds of great and amazing sounds, still relying on the same old major minor chords and scales and simplified melodies and equal temperament, even though the possibilities could all be there for everybody. Digital equal temperament is wiping out the details from music all across the world. And if we can think about equal temperament as being a grid of some sort, the real question has to be not why does the grid exist, but whose grid is it and what is the grid there for? And so this is where Leimma and Apotome come in. Apotome and its sister application Leimma are two non-commercial tools that run in the web browser using novel web MIDI and web audio. Leimma is a tool for exploring tuning systems and their subsets or creating your own. And Apotome is a tool to create generative music using them. They both output MIDI and can be used with any other software or hardware instruments. The drive behind creating them was to have accessible and intuitive and easy to use tools that would allow us to explore some of these repressed possibilities and find different ways to express especially the music of non-Western cultures that has so far really been trapped in sticking to its traditions and the traditional instruments that are associated with it. With all the tools at our disposal and all the technologies at our disposal today, there's no reason why these musical cultures should either lose their identity or remain trapped in a kind of museum-style scenario where the musicians are just expected to play traditional or ethnic music and nothing else. And this is partly why we designed them to run in the web browser. It's a kind of political choice. I've done workshops with musicians from around the globe, and there was one workshop I did where I needed to use open source software. I was a little bit dubious at first because I thought that using open source software wouldn't allow those students or participants to actually understand how modern software works and what the kind of capabilities are. But the reality is, and as we've seen through the pandemic of 2020, that access to these kinds of technologies, especially when it comes to expensive softwares, it's not only a third world problem. And even though running a web browser needs a laptop of some kind, it's still far less demanding on the laptop's capabilities than modern software that needs a certain amount of CPU power for it to be able to do its job properly. The reason behind creating a generative music making environment rather than a sequencing or a straightforward composition environment was also to try and encourage to breaking some of the rules and exploring things that we haven't heard yet. It's very easy for musicians to get caught up in the muscle memory that they've developed and to do very similar sounding things all the time, especially when they're trying to search for something new or discover the nooks and crannies of musical culture that maybe haven't been done before. We all rely on recordings and the experience and output of other composers and musicians in order to be inspired and to have new ideas, to mix things up and to create something that's different. Generative environments allow for that without too much effort. They allow us to hear things that we wouldn't normally do, that things that we wouldn't normally program. Most of the time they can sound pretty ugly, but with a little bit of effort and a little bit of refinement, I think at the very least they can help us untrain our ears and learn to listen in a different way and therefore inspire different ideas. It's not necessarily that the environment itself will be the tool that creates the music, but I hope, at least, that it might be able to inspire a different kind of listening and a different kind of sensitivity and a different way of thinking about what these different musical cultures could do. In order to use Apotome for the generative music making, it's important to have a quick look at Leimma. Leimma allows you to do two different things. We can either explore tuning systems that already exist or create a new tuning system. And it's easiest to go through the process of creating a new system in order to understand how it works. The first thing that we need to do is to decide what our reference pitch should be. We've all probably heard of A4 as 440 Hertz. This is a reference pitch that's used by all the digital tools of today and most Western music making. But there is another common value, which is C at 261 Hertz. Once you've chosen the reference pitch, you go on to creating the divisions of the octave. Now, in literature, divisions of the octave are either defined as ratios, so divisions that are relative to the reference pitch, or in the values of cents. And this is a measurement that was devised by Alexander Ellis. So here we can either add a ratio, for example, the ratio of a perfect fifth, or we can type in a cents value of whatever we want. So there's 133. We can also break all the rules and just create a new tuning system simply by clicking with the mouse. Once we've created our tuning system, we see it here as a wheel representing the fact that it's cyclical and it's the same across all the different octaves. And just by using our QWERTY keyboard, we can map these to keys that are playable. So I'm going to just randomly map these. Or maybe we should do that. And the beauty of this is that we can also play them polyphonically. And we can also send the MIDI to any external hardware devices or the virtual bus in order to use a software instrument. So here I'm using a virtual mini-moog, and as you'll be able to hear, it's the same as the tuning system that we heard from the internal synthesizer. The other way to use Leimma is to explore already existing tuning systems. And we can do that by going to the database and choosing a tuning system that is already there. I'm going to try this tuning system by Al-Farabi, which is based on putting 10 frets on an oud. And as we can see, the divisions of the octave are all laid out here in the ratios values that I had inputted earlier into the database. And if we get that back to the internal synth, we can hear them, we can edit them if we want, and we could even add our own if we wanted to do something even stranger. Then we can go to the wheel view and we can either create our own mapping or use existing subsets, existing scales that are already in the database. So if we try this maqam huzam, which is mapped to the note E. So once we've created a new tuning system or explored existing tuning systems and had developed a rough idea of what we'd like to do, we can jump into Apotome and start using the generative environment to create some music. Apotome is based on these tracks that have all these different modules. And the most important thing about it is that it's not based on any algorithm that is hidden away in the code. Essentially, every time you create a modulation to some of these parameters or change something, you're more or less creating your own algorithm or a variation of an algorithm that you've already done. The only thing that exists in the background is the random selection of notes from whatever possibilities exist in the tuning system and the subset. For an in-depth tutorial on how to use this, please check out the other videos, but this is just a quick overview. We have the ability to adjust what pitch degrees are triggered from these tunings and subsets, what intervals are allowed, what octaves, the time signature, accenting, the kind of beat divisions, including a small Euclidean rhythm creator. We have the ability for looping or capturing the previous 1, 2, 3, or 4 bars, which is nice for improvising and live performance, a randomized note delay, articulation range from legato to staccato, a velocity range, and then a small selection of web synths that were designed or ported by Jai Kleimola from Web Audio Modules. This is a version of the famous Yamaha DX7, and we also have a version of the Oberheim OBX, plus a simple basic synthesizer, and obviously the ability to send out MIDI to hardware or software instruments. There are a few LFOs to help modulate some of the parameters and a small mixer section at the end. We can have up to 8 tracks that can all be assigned to do different things. They can all use the same tuning system, or they can all have different tuning systems. But the most fun part is this snapshot section here, which allows you to create snapshots of all the settings within Apotome at any given time. So that allows for a slightly more meaningful and more developed compositional process using these generative parameters, because you could have a snapshot set to a specific tuning system and a subset, and then jump to a completely different one, or change instruments, or have completely different settings. The possibilities are endless, as is kind of the general trend with most of the technologies that we have today.